Great. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit of what Emily had to say, and then after that, I'm going to bring up my one main point, which is the social consequences of genetic experimentation, in that I'm going to get into the issue of what we view as humanity and the idea of the religious right within our society. I'm also going to talk about animal rights and how we see that as human beings. But first I'm going to talk a little bit about what Emily said. So Emily stood up and she talked to us about how it happened shouldn't matter. Like, what we worry about in with government regulation is the end result rather than how that comes about. But we don't think this is true. On our side of the house, we would contend that it's far better to implement regulations that can prevent harms from occurring rather than waiting until it happens and then preventing it. When we can see that something would be dangerous, we do regulate it and we do prevent it, right? Like, that's why we have regulations on safe business practices and things like that. We don't just allow people to go wild in society and then regulate it afterwards. When we see there is a clear potential harm, we do regulate that. Secondly, she brought up the idea that humans don't respect the natural order. I'm going to get to this on our point, but we would in fact say that we do think humans are respecting the natural order. We think there are certainly problems with how humans act in society, but we think that genetic experimentation unfettered is a step forward that we don't really want to take, and we don't think humans should be taking. So she also brought up the idea that we have more control over genetic modification than we do when we're crossbreeding, which we think is just blatantly false. Like, the basic difference there is, like, when you're crossbreeding, let's say I've got Emily and Ian, and we're going to crossbreed them. We know that like their general traits, right? We can make up a Punnett square generally. We know that we're not going to get some sort of crazy combination because it's been working for basically thousands and thousands of years. We know that generally when two pigs interbreed, it's going to produce a pig. And they're going to have basically the same traits that a pig generally has. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to insult you guys. Different example. But the difference with genetic experimentation, and particularly with gene splicing, is we really don't know what the effects are going to be. As good as science is, we don't really know everything about the gene. We don't know everything about the different scientific, Robert. We don't know everything about different scientific effects. As much as Robert would like to say we do, we don't. That's why we have lots and lots of problems with things like Dolly the sheep, who only lived like 3 years after we cloned them. Okay. So, Emily also brought up the idea that we should only regulate when there's a clear harm. Well, we do think there's a clear harm inside opposition today. We think that first, there is the risk of, like, because we don't know the full effects of what's going to happen, like, we don't necessarily know that genetically modifying this trait here isn't going to have this effect in our larger ecosystem. We think since we don't have that knowledge, we shouldn't be straying so far. Go.
But what we do know is that we have significant problems with global warming and other situations that this kind of technology could help us with. So why are we dealing with uncertain
Okay, yes, there
harm?
may be tangential benefits to some sort of genetic experimentation, but we think that that's something that we should be taking really carefully into consideration. We should be examining every single effect that we could possibly have so we don't end up with larger environmental impacts. Like CFCs, for example. That was something we thought was a really, really good invention in society. Basically revolutionized our technology industry. But we found out a few years later that CFCs were actually really harmful for our ozone layer. Like, the fact is, when we're inventing something on this stream, we don't necessarily know that it's going to affect something way on this stream. We don't look into that, and that's the big danger with genetic experimentation. Okay, she also brought up the idea that we're going to get great innovators. Like, we're going to get some cool scientists. But we don't say, just because we're going to get a couple more cool scientists, we're going to abolish all sorts of other laws here. That's a ridiculous argument. Safety should always be the first thing. Like, we're not going to abolish all human rights laws just because we think we could get some really cool politicians, right? Or other sorts of innovators. Like, we don't do that in society. That doesn't make sense. So that point doesn't stand either. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the social consequences of genetic experimentation. Well, we do have to think about the large balance of people with religion in our society. Like, there are a lot of people that do think that life is God-given and it should be God-given. And while we do say that in certain cases, we still do have to go, like, we still do things like crossbreeding and things like that, we think that there should be a criteria for that. Like, when do we allow humans to intervene in the natural order? We think that there's 3 criteria on this side of the house that have to be fulfilled. First off, it has to be necessary in our society. Secondly, it has to be safe. And third, we have to understand its consequences. We think that even if there may be a benefit to genetic engineering, the fact that life has existed for thousands and thousands of years means that it's not really necessary because we essentially haven't been splicing genes for that long. Secondly, we don't necessarily know that it's safe. So Pat brought up the idea that it will get out. If it does get out, it can have huge impacts on our society. And third, we don't understand its consequences. We don't necessarily know if we're splicing a gene, what's going to happen there. Okay, so secondly, bringing up the idea of animal rights. So humans like to think of ourselves as compassionate beings. Like, we aren't just out to be the best species. There's also the idea that we do feel empathy for animals in society. Like, that's why things like that movie about guinea pigs or whatever, it was the top of the box office because we like to believe that we're compassionate beings and we do feel like animals are kinship beings. So sometimes it is true we do have to take away the rights of animals, but it's not like what Emily said where we don't really care about the role of the mouse. We do say sometimes animal experimentation is okay, but we think it has to fulfill 2 criteria again. First off, it's necessary, and secondly, we're reducing the harm. We don't think in either case unfettered experimentation fits those criteria, and therefore we don't really think that it's being safe to our conception of animal rights in society. Essentially, splicing the genes of mice, growing an ear on a human ear on a mouse or something like that, we don't think that that's necessarily a good thing for the mouse, and we don't think that it's reducing harm, so we don't think we should be doing it. Okay, so third, we have the question of the role of the human in society. One of the things they're attempting to do right now is modifying pig organs to make them more like human organs, and though this does have a huge benefit in society, it also brings up the issue of what is a human? And we think that that is a really big question, and society is not necessarily ready to address it. So because of the social consequences of genetic experimentation, and because of the inherent dangers in society by going through with something like this in an unfettered manner, we stand strongly in opposition. Thank you.